Yeah. All right, thank you. So, so I have these two documents. One is called the Gospel of Miracles, and the other one is called the Sayings of Jesus. So I wanted to say a little bit. I'm not going to go into the documents unless you all decide that you want to get into those today, but I just want to explain what they are. So when you get them, you'll sort of have an idea. First, the Gospel of Miracles is a collection of passages that scholars believe originally circulated sort of independently, and that they were used by both the author of Mark and the author of John as a kind of framework, I guess you could say, or partial framework for their gospels, for their narrative story of Jesus. So these are really literally stories of miracles of Jesus that are found in both the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of John in roughly the same sequence. The translation will seem a little unfamiliar because, again, I've relied on the Jesus Seminar translations just because I like them. They try to stick to the original style, I guess you could say, as close as they can, the original style of the Greek in which the Gospels are written. So, first one's fairly short, Gospel of Miracles. It lists these things since they're in the same sequence, and since the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John have almost nothing else in common. You know, the sayings of Jesus are very different, even in some cases, sequences of events and that sort of thing. It seemed obvious to scholars that both of them use this list of this series of stories as a framework. And it was not uncommon in those days for people to write little collections of miracle stories of various figures whether it was in Judaism or in the Greco-Roman world, different heroic stories. So that's kind of what that is. And we can kind of talk about that once you have a chance to look it over. There's one other thing I want to say about that. There's an interesting piece at the end that most people haven't been exposed to. I do explain it on the handout, but it's a story that's very similar to the story of the raising of Lazarus that we find in the Gospel of John. But according to some ancient documents, this story was originally in the story that's in there was originally in the Gospel of Mark, which came to be called the secret Gospel of Mark. So Mark had originally a somewhat different version with this story in it, and it's a story of the raising of Lazarus. Okay, so in our canonical Gospels, the story of the raising of Lazarus is found only in the Gospel of John, and according to ancient authorities, this version that's in the document was also found in the Gospel of Mark, and you'll see some similarities and some sort of striking differences. So it's pretty interesting little document of how the sort of miracle stories started to be gathered or built up together. The other document is really a list of sayings of Jesus that scholars believe that there's, the strongest evidence for those having originated with Jesus. There are many sayings that they think, were basically, for one reason or another, invented by the gospel writers, either to have a conversation within a story or for the author of the gospel to express what their interpretations or ideas are of what Jesus meant or what he said. So there's a lot of stuff like that that's not on this list. All right. So these lists, and when you look at the list that way, you get, I think, a somewhat different picture than you might have had of who Jesus was and what he taught. So I've arranged the sayings in the second document roughly by themes or topics. Okay. So they're kind of clustered together, but I think you'll find it interesting just to read them as they are and draw your own conclusions about their meaning. Because remember, that's really what disciples of Jesus did. Jesus told these stories and said these things, and then people had to try to make sense of them, interpret them. Right? So when he tells a story, what does a story mean? Well, he leaves that to his listeners. he clearly intended to convey something, and so it's kind of, I think it's spiritually and even intellectually and emotionally beneficial to just sort of look at what the master said, and see what it means to you, as if you were one of his original listeners, without the theology around it, without the framework, without the explanations, just encountering that voice and what it was he was expressing and what it was he was trying to convey, what it means to you. So, and Maya was mentioning before we started the class that she thought just the list of sayings would be enough for a 6-week course, and I think that's certainly true by the time we dug into them and started talking about what they meant to us and that sort of thing. So my plan for today is to kind of put that aside, let you see the documents and see where you want to go with them, and then to try to address some of the questions that I received through Maya that some of you have asked. We got into it a little bit last week, and so we're going to go a little bit farther along here. And as we go, if any of you have any comments or questions, I'm going to say just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak as if we're sitting around a table having a conversation, because that's kind of what we're doing. Okay. All right. So I'll stop here for a second, breathe, and see if anyone has anything that they want to ask now, comments or things you want to discuss, or any questions about the documents that are going to be sent to you. Anybody got anything burning on your mind right at the moment? Okay, good. So one of the questions that was asked is kind of the next one I'm getting to here, is about the virgin birth story and what are we to think of that. And so I thought, I'm kind of sort of following a narrative, very loosely a narrative here, a story, and I'm thinking about what we might conclude about things. So the virgin birth, is that something that metaphysicians believe in, or ought to believe in, or we need to believe in? And so I'm going to start by saying, no, it's not something that you need to believe in. And I'm going to add that evidently Charles Fillmore and Myrtle Fillmore both believed in the virgin birth miracle, and they had a metaphysical explanation for it, or at least Charles had a metaphysical explanation for what he thought happened. So I think within unity, you always have the choice of what, to believe what makes most sense to you, what you intuitively or rationally feel. But this is what Charles said, and this is from the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary. So I thought you may not be acquainted with this. Charles wrote, Mary expected the birth of the Messiah. She was overshadowed by that high idea. It formed in her mind the seed that quickened into the cell, and in due season there was an aggregation of cells strong enough in their activity to attract the attention of the outer consciousness, and what is called the birth of Christ took place. So what does that all mean? Well, again, Charles thinking of consciousness and mind and thought, and he thought, he believed, and I actually believe this is pretty much true as well, although maybe not quite the way he did, but that the foundation of the universe is mind and ideas, divine ideas, perfect ideas, and that part of our function in individual consciousness is to bring forth those ideas through our own thoughts and actions, our thoughts, words, and actions, to bring those ideas into manifestation, into expression. And so what he's saying here is that Mary somehow he believes she caught sight of the Messiah idea and was so focused on it that it formed a cell within her, and the cell basically multiplied in sort of the normal way. He said that the cells, their activity is strong enough to attract the attention of the outer consciousness. Okay, so it's again the process of manifestation is from inward outward, and so that's what he's saying. Her thought was so focused on it, her devotion, as he puts it, her intuition was so focused on it that it literally just sort of manifested. So that's sort of his explanation, which is clearly different than the Orthodox explanation of, well, just the Holy Spirit did it. Okay, he makes Mary much more involved in the whole situation than how it happened. Okay, it's still the activity of the Spirit, but it's, he expresses an idea that her consciousness was somehow involved. And whether you take that very, except what he says very literally or not, it seems to me that there must have been something in Mary's consciousness as the mother of Jesus that had something to do with him becoming who he was. So whether it's just this precise metaphysical process that Charles describes, or more how any mother in one way or another affects her children, Mary's consciousness obviously had something to do with how Jesus turned out in sort of a normal process. So you can look at it that way, but there are other ways of looking at it. And so if you examine the birth stories in the Gospels, if you kind of go searching for them and look at them and compare them, what you discover, first of all, is there is no birth story in the Gospel of Mark, and there is no birth story in the Gospel of John. So half of the Gospels don't have a miracle birth story, right? Mark is the earliest gospel, right? And Matthew and Luke both use Mark to construct their gospels. And of course, the Gospel of John tells us the Word became flesh. It doesn't really go into any kind of birth story at all. And Mark starts with John the Baptist, so he has no birth story. So Matthew and Luke, I should say, construct birth stories. I think they constructed them. Okay, I don't think they heard these stories from the family, right? And they're different stories. Okay, we tend to think of the Christmas story as one thing, and we have all our images when we celebrate Christmas of the manger and the stable and the wise men and the shepherds and the animals and all that stuff and the star. Okay, but when you look at where those stories came from, some of that stuff's from Matthew, some of it's from Luke, and they're completely different. So Matthew, Jesus is born apparently in a room in a house. And so there's no stable, there's no tax census that you find in Luke. There's just, he's born in a house, and some magi come from the east, some wise men who had been Zoroastrian priests. The Zoroastrian priests were the astrologers of the ancient world, and they had a reputation for showing up at important events because they could see by what was happening in the heavens that something important was going to take place in a certain area. And so a lot of people believed that sort of that reputation of the Zoroastrian priests, and evidently Matthew was one of them who believed that. People all over the Mediterranean world knew about the Zoroastrians. They were just as well known as Judaism was at that time, and in fact, and influenced Judaism. But anyway, so the wise men show up in Matthew, and then they're warned not to go back by the same route they went, and Joseph is warned, Jesus' father is warned to go down into Egypt. Okay. So you have the whole Herod story. Okay, all that stuff is from Matthew. Luke's story is where the Romans are having they're having a census for tax purposes, and they make everybody go to the town of their origin. That's fishy right away because the Romans didn't do that. That would have been a bureaucratic nightmare. The Romans just went into town and collected taxes from whoever was there. They didn't really care where you were from. It didn't matter to them. They didn't expect you to go back to, your hometown. This is an invention of Luke to get Jesus and his family from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. Matthew also puts them in Bethlehem. Okay, so why Bethlehem? Well, it was connected with the prophecy that the Messiah was going to be a son of David, born in the town of David, which was Bethlehem. So in order to fulfill the prophecies, they had to put his birth in Bethlehem somehow. And Luke devises this rather arcane story of a census. So they go down there. There's no room at the inn. So now it's not a house. There's no room at the inn, but they can stay in a stable, and they put the baby in a manger. And then not wise men from the east, but shepherds show up. Shepherds, the wise men followed a star. The shepherds heard, were told to go there by some angels, a heavenly host. So again, those two different things. The angels are not in Matthew's version, but they are in Luke's. So we've sort of conflated all that stuff together over the centuries, over the millennia. And so the stories themselves pretty clearly are constructions, individual constructions, with kind of one thing in common: the prophecy of being born in Bethlehem. And the other thing, but why a virgin birth? Because Matthew and Luke both emphasize that. And again, Mark doesn't really go into that. So what does Mark have to say? Well, what we know from Mark is that Jesus was known in his hometown as Jesus, son of Mary. It turns out to call someone the son of their mother was kind of the same thing as calling them a bastard. So as a sort of disparaging term, it meant the person was, conceived out of wedlock, basically, right? That was the implication of it. And so Mark just sort of mentions that, doesn't really say much more about it. So Matthew and Luke, again, writing a little later to different communities, need to make sort of sense of that little passage, that known fact that Jesus in his hometown was called son of Mary, as a kind of insult. So, well, what do you do with that? Sort of the idea is, well, he didn't have his father wasn't married to his mother. And they hit upon this passage, another prophecy that that a son was going to be born to a young woman, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Well, there's a whole story behind that particular prophecy that, again, it's not really even a messianic prophecy in the usual sense. The context of it is one of the prophets is telling the people how long it's going to take for something to happen. How long it's going to take is that the amount of time it takes for this child to be born and grow up. So like one generation, but also there's an idea that this child will be the new king of Israel. Okay, so it's a prophecy of something that in those times was just an expectation that well, that's a whole nother story. We don't need to necessarily go into what the expectation was, but it's just, the point is, there's this passage. What if we take this passage in Greek? One of the words, a word for young woman also can mean virgin. And so they make Mary a virgin. Okay, so if Mary is a virgin, how did Jesus get born? Well, the Holy Spirit. It was a miracle of God. So you get the virgin birth story. In Judaism, that wasn't really a thing. Moses wasn't born of a virgin. It wasn't really an idea that was in that thought world. It really was more of an idea that was in the Gentile thought world. There were stories about heroes who were born, who were born because one of the gods impregnated a young woman, and so they became. I think that's a story behind Hercules, for example, or Heracles, as he was called, right? So the idea is more of a pagan idea that involves gods and humans having intercourse. That's common in Greco-Roman mythology, but not really in Judaism. So they're writing partly to explain something to the Gentiles and to make that, this guy's the son of God. And what that meant to the Gentiles was, well, then God was his father. He must have been born of a human mother, but that God, impregnated her. And so that whole model made perfect sense to the Gentiles. And of course, a lot of the things that the Christian evangelists wanted to do was convert Gentiles. So you think about it, you can kind of see the thought process behind the story. You can see a motivation for it. Okay, so that's another possibility, another possible explanation, I think, for why the story is in Matthew and Luke, and why it's different is that Matthew and Luke are writing independently from different perspectives, but really trying to write about the same well-known passages from their scriptures that had become associated with the idea of a prophecy of a coming Messiah in Judaism. So they combined the Messiah in Judaism idea with the pagan idea of demigods or offsprings of the gods, the heroic superheroic figures. They bring those kinds of pieces together. So, I mean, that's an explanation that makes kind of more sense to me than the literal interpretation. But again, I live in the context of the 21st century in the world of science and that sort of thing. So I have some sort of culturally embedded skepticism about some of the miracle stories, and this explanation just makes a whole lot more sense to me. Okay, so I'll stop here for a second and see what you all think.
Yeah. Do you really think that, I mean, this baby began without the presence of a male sperm?
No, I don't believe that.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying that's what Matthew and Luke are saying specifically to the people that they're speaking to the people they're telling the story to. And the people they're telling the story to, it would have been believable because they already believed stories like that.
Right.
It was part of their mythology. Yeah.
Right.
In fact,
but I mean, from a scientific, I mean, even though I'm thinking now metaphysically, and Charles Fillmore's thing about, the intensity of these young girls, focused and her whole being consumed by the idea of the coming Messiah, and then somehow, did I hear you right? Fillmore said she ended up being able to manifest on a cellular level.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's with Metaphysical Bible Dictionary. And I remember reading somewhere that Myrtle believes something like that as well. She'd written about it. Not in that same exact language, but something like it was, Mary's consciousness. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting speculation, and it's not entirely outside of the realm of that metaphysical perspective. If everything's mind and consciousness, then who knows for sure what's possible. I just think it's more likely I think my explanation is more likely Jesus was known to have been conceived out of wedlock in his hometown, and that sort of fit with the idea of, sort of naturally fit with the idea of making him an offspring of God, and God having caused that. In Judaism, they were used to sort of miraculous sounding birth stories, right? Like Sarah giving birth to Isaac at the age of, what was she, 90 or something like that? She was 90 years old, something like that. So there are kind of stories like that, just not quite to this extreme. Yeah. So I mean, I don't think anybody's foolish for believing in the virgin birth. I just don't find, based on what I know about the scriptures and how they were put together, I just don't find it convincing. I just think it's, it's a story told for propaganda purposes, if you want to put it that way. They're trying to spread a religion. They're not trying to write biography as we think of biography, right? They're trying to convince people Jesus was the Messiah. And so, that's a good argument. He worked miracles, and his very birth was a miracle, right?
Right.
That's part of how they're trying to persuade people. That's what makes sense to me. Like I said, I don't think anybody's foolish for having faith. I just don't seem to have it. At least not. I don't have faith in that story. Put it that way.
Is it also an issue of mixing apples and oranges? I mean, like levels. I mean, couldn't it be true that on a metaphysical level that this young woman was ready, or maybe was in an altered state in her devotion to the idea of the Messiah, but then she also had a physical relationship with somebody, a man, Joseph.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think I see what you're saying. So the part about her having,
it's like something, isn't it?
Her consciousness attracted this kind of thing.
Well, she would have been open for it, let's say, and then she had sex. I don't know. Maybe she was in an altered state. Maybe she didn't even notice what happened to her, but she had sexual relation that produced the beginning of the baby, right? And but the whole thing, in my understanding, or in the way I see it, doesn't lose any of its innocence. It doesn't. She could still be, I don't like the word virginal, but she could be so innocent in
Innocent in
her
heart.
absolute devotion to the coming of the Messiah. And somehow, and here comes the other element, that she was a visionary and she did have a visitation
Yeah,
from someone high
yeah,
that said,
absolutely.
"Blessed on you are you," and she believed it, and she took her pregnancy as, the beginning of the Messiah will be born. And then Joseph, wasn't there somewhere where God went to Joseph and said, "You now take that young woman,
Yeah, yeah.
and stand by her,"
He was gonna quietly divorce her
right?
or break the engagement or whatever, and then
Right, right.
Angel told him not to, so he didn't. It's
And
the
I,
upshot. I think
in the
that's in
whole,
Matthew. I think that's in Matthew. Yeah.
yeah. No,
Well, I'm not sure.
I feel like
One of them.
that I do not want to take away the absolute beauty and innocence of the story of this young woman, her visitation from the angel Gabriel and all that, and her willingness to serve, to be the maiden, right, for this happening. Uh, I don't want just because she ended up because somehow she had sex, but that doesn't diminish. You know what I mean? It doesn't diminish in my feeling about the beauty of this woman, the
Yeah.
willingness to be of
Yeah.
service.
We don't know anything about Mary really, other than she was the mother of Jesus and very few other things that I'll get to later. But um, so, if you think about, like I said, it's sort of at the outset, Mary's consciousness had to have something to do because she's his
Yeah,
mother. Her consciousness had something to do with him becoming what he was. But Luke tells the story in a very beautiful way. There's poetry in it. There's an angelic vision, and Mary recites the Magnificat and all this beautiful poetic story. And I think that has value in and of itself. It doesn't have to be historically true to have spiritual meaning and beauty, right?
right.
You can find spiritual meaning in beautiful fiction and beautiful poetry. So it's looking at we can look at it a number of different ways. We can look at it kind of like Charles Fillmore did, with everything is symbolic of something happening in the realm of consciousness, which I think is true. Charles also tended to take the stories in the Gospels to be literally true. I mean, if you look at his comments on it, he just seems to think everything that's in there is factual. What's different about his approach is he thinks of it as metaphorical or allegorical as well, right? So he talks about it as if all the stuff happened. And so, the virgin birth happened, according to the Gospels, must be true. And so he explains it metaphysically. That's sort of his approach. I look at the Gospels as kind of a poetic historical fiction, which is to say, I think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all mainly created narratives out of a little bit of information that they had about the life and sayings of Jesus, that they pulled it together. But I also used their imagination. And part of the reason I believe that is that's the way that stuff was written back then. They didn't cite sources and do footnotes and double check everything, document it. They had a basic framework for a story, and then they imagined it as it ought to have taken place. So that's history in the ancient world, in a sense. Yeah, from the ancient world's perspective, the gospel writers are writing history. From our perspective, it's kind of something more like historical fiction, which can convey historical truths mixed in with imagination. One of my favorite genres of literature is a good historical fiction, right?
Right.
It's based on stuff that actually happened and characters, and sometimes they even use words of the historical people, but basically they're just imagining a lot of stuff. They're imagining conversations and events that there's no evidence for to tell a story. So I kind of think of maybe that's I think maybe that's the most accurate way to think about the Gospels, is that they're historical fiction with a poetic and spiritual intention, and that they're also, religious propaganda. They're written to convert people, not to record history in the usual sense. Does that
makes sense?
make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not, I don't have any issues with people taking, everything in the Bible as being literally true. I don't object to that, for them having faith in that. It's just, I think it's an intellectually incoherent position because there's too many contradictions, including, I don't think the stories, they found ways to weave together the Christmas stories to make it seem like it's all one thing, all happened the same day. That's what preachers have been doing for a couple thousand years now. But there is also the fact that in Matthew and Luke, they have supposed genealogies of Joseph. This is the genealogy of Joseph, father of Jesus. Matthew and Luke both do that. They both have him descended from Abraham. They both have him descended from David, but they have different numbers of generations, different names. The son of David in Luke, I think, is Nathan, and in Matthew, it's Solomon, right? So different lineage, different numbers of generations. They can't both literally be true. Joseph could not have had literally two different patriarchal lineages, right? With different numbers of generations and different names. And there's just no way of getting around that. These two genealogies are completely contradictory, except for a few shared names. Even Joseph's father's name is different in the two genealogies. Mm-hmm. One of the way the church has sort of gotten around that, I've noticed this, people are very sort of literalistic, evangelicals and Catholics will say, oh, well, one of those was actually the genealogy of Mary. No, it isn't. It doesn't mention Mary in the genealogy. They both very explicitly say Joseph right at the end. Joseph, the father of Jesus. So they just kind of tell a lie to cover a contradiction. It's just crazy to me, but that's my issue, not yours. So I got that off my chest. But anyway, that's a problem. To me, why cling to this notion that everything has to be literally true when pretty clearly it can't be? That's one really glaring example of contradiction, but there are others, and there's no point in just sort of going into a list of it. Why not look at the scriptures in a different way? Why not look at them as, like I said, sort of historical fiction with an important spiritual message, and that the important thing is the spiritual message? And I think that was true for the authors as well. I said that, they wrote it as propaganda, but also they thought it was propaganda for a really important spiritual message. So to me, that just makes a whole lot more sense. And I love doing the allegorical interpretation, metaphorical interpretation, like we do in metaphysics. I think that has legitimacy too, right? To sort of uncover meanings based on names and places and events, to uncover, because that's kind of what we do a lot of times with poetry. We read poetry and it's kind of absurd. What does that mean? And then we sort of abstract our own meaning from it. I think Charles did a lot of really good interpretation. It's pretty hard to top, so very helpful, at least as starting points. We can relate it to ourselves. Okay. I've kind of gone on about that for a pretty long time. Does anybody have any other comments? Or
Can you say something? Did he have brothers and sisters, Jesus?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that too.
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to also ask about, is there reason to believe that Joseph actually was the father of Jesus, or is that also part of the story? I think he was probably the fiancé of Mary.
Yeah, there's the evidence for Jesus' father being named Joseph is strong enough. It's Matthew claims that, the Gospel of John claims that, and again, those seem to be sort of independently written. So pretty strong tradition that Joseph was the father. Yeah. and that's where you get to the children part.
Yeah.
Actually, I was listening to a funeral service on Zoom in the last year, and the priest made a point of saying that Joseph was the adoptive father, and I had never in my life heard that before in the Catholic Church. And I thought, where is this coming from?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's
If Joseph was not the father, then what else would you call him?
Yeah, that's right.
it's a post-dogmatic interpretation, and I'll explain what I mean by that, because I was going to go into the brothers and sisters next.
Good.
Yeah. So let's see. Oh, somebody asked about the relationship. I'm going to go back to that and just sort of get into the brother and sister issue here. I'm going to scroll down, and where did I put that? Okay, so Jesus had 4 brothers. Here we go. 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. Okay, at least 2. Okay. So the brothers' names were, they're given in Mark and some of the other Gospels. James, Judas, Simon, and Joseph, or Joseph. I'm not sure how to pronounce it exactly, but actually it's short for Joseph. So he had a brother evidently named after Joseph, right? But they called him Joseph because it was kind of a nickname and to distinguish him from his father. And Judas is also known as Jude, okay, which is another rendering of that name. Okay, so those are the 4 brothers. It only tells us that he had 2 sisters. However, and it doesn't actually explicitly name them, but there are very old traditions that one of Jesus' sisters' name was Mary. We find this actually referenced in the Gnostic Gospel. So one of his sisters was named after the mother, Mary. And there's also a very old tradition, I think in the Eastern Orthodox Church, that another one of his sisters was named Salome. Okay, so Salome is mentioned in as being part of the inner circle in the Gospel of Mark. She's there at the crucifixion, and she's there at the tomb. Why is Salome there? Well, it would make sense if she was Jesus' sister that she would be there, right? And the other sister, Mary, would also have been there. Okay, so Mary the mother, Mary the sister, and Salome the sister. And he may have had more sisters, but that's kind of the only information we have from ancient times. So he had those 4 brothers. Now there's 3 different traditions, common traditions about the brothers and sisters. And this goes back to what Gloria brought up, all right? So what happened in the Western Church was at a certain point, the bishops and the Pope decided to affirm the dogma of Mary's perpetual virginity. So if Mary was perpetually a virgin, she couldn't have had other children. So where did those siblings come from, right? So one of the things that in Western tradition, they've often said that, well, they weren't really brothers and sisters, they were cousins.
Ah, right.
There's not really any reason to think that, other than the Greek word can be used sometime for cousins, but it's far more likely that it specifically calls them brothers and sisters because that's what they were, right? So, but anyway, that's one Western tradition that sort of supports the perpetual virginity of Mary. All right. So another tradition, the Eastern Orthodox tradition, like Greek, Russian Orthodox, that sort of thing, their explanation was that Joseph was previously married. And so the brothers and sisters were kind of stepbrothers and sisters, right? So they were the children from a previous marriage. So it's kind of the story. Joseph was, married Mary as his second wife, that he would have been much older than her and had these children. And of course, if that's the case, then Jesus was the youngest brother, not the oldest brother. Right? They were all born before him, so he was the youngest. He was the baby. Okay, and then I think a kind of common sense reading of the scriptures, when you're not trying to protect different kinds of dogmas and stuff, is just Jesus was the oldest brother of these siblings. Okay, because at one point in the Gospels it said Jesus was the firstborn. If you say somebody's the firstborn, then that means there's also second, third, and fourth, whatever. Right? So that interpretation makes a little bit more sense to me, and that's a much more common interpretation. So you have a kind of Western Catholic perspective that they were cousins, the Eastern Catholic perspective, the Eastern Orthodox perspective that they were children by another marriage. And then you have a sort of common sense and more commonly accepted idea among scholars that they were actually just brothers and sisters by Joseph and Mary, and Jesus was the oldest, right? Now, I have a fourth suggestion, and this one's a little bit off the wall, and it's not really tremendously different. I think it's possible that Jesus wasn't the firstborn. And my reason for thinking that is it doesn't really tell us, in some of the other gospels, all the gospels don't say he was the firstborn, but there's another thing. We know something about Jesus' brother James. Of course, we know something about Jesus. Now, James is much more conservative even than Jesus is, as far as his religious views are. He's much more traditional. He's, he goes to the temple and prays every day. His, according to the, according to the traditions, James always kind of is sort of conservative. He will push back against some of the ideas like we can eat anything. And he goes, well, let's get rid of kosher. No, wait a minute. Let's have some rules about that. So from what we do know some things about James from the book of Acts, but also from some writing in the historian Josephus. Actually, Josephus said more about what he called James, the brother of Jesus, than he did about Jesus himself. And because there's stories in there about James that Josephus wanted to tell. So, okay, what am I getting at? Well, James is the conservative, pious, good brother. He's kind of a take charge guy. As soon as Jesus is crucified, so all of a sudden James is the leader of the community. Right? James, the brother of Jesus. He takes charge. Okay. Jesus, on the other hand, is kind of a peacemaker. He's kind of rebellious. He's less tethered to the family. He's the adventurous brother. He goes out and travels and separates from the family, even seems to be estranged from them for a time. So looking at their characteristics from a perspective of sibling birth order, psychologists believe in, right? That there's some evidence for that. Jesus is more like a second or middle child, and James is more like the older brother. Now, if you're in a family with multiple siblings, you can probably relate to this right away, because most of my experiences, and this is pretty true. The oldest child is pretty bossy, takes charge, more conservative, more connected to the home. And then the middle children are the ones that sort of spread their wings a little bit. They're a little more adventurous. We even see that in the story of the prodigal son, now that I think of it, right? The older brother stays home, does what his dad tells him to. The younger brother takes off. I'm going to have some fun. I'm going to see the world kind of thing, right? It's a perfect example of that.
That's not the way it was in my family.
Wasn't the way it was in your family? Okay. Well, I'm not saying it's universal. There can be exceptions, right? There can be exceptions. It was the way in my family and other families I've observed, but I'm sure it's not always the case. But so anyway, my theory is it's possible that Jesus actually wasn't the firstborn, but that he was the secondborn, or even the third, if you're going to throw it out of order. So
okay,
that's another possibility. I don't think it's,
so,
like I said, it's a little bit off the charts. I don't know anybody else that's held that position, and I'm not sure I hold it, but
I think one reason people may.
Whoops, you just muted yourself, Rosemary. Unmute again. Somehow you exited.
Sorry. I think one reason why people may not have held that position is that Joseph was called the fiancé of Mary when she was pregnant. Now, that would imply that he was betrothed to her and was committed to marry her. Now, right. I don't know if that would have been true for a second marriage, but.
Yeah, that part I don't know either. I mean, I don't know if, the story that, any of those stories, any of those versions is possible, right? Maybe they were just cousins. Maybe they were children by previous marriage, I don't know.
Or they could have been half siblings, or who knows? Yeah.
Yeah. So my point is there's multiple possibilities. And I think the least likely one is actually the one that's commonly accepted, that they were cousins. I think that's highly unlikely from everything else we know about the early church history, not only from Acts, but from other sources. It appears James was accepted. James and the others were accepted as his brothers. Not much is said about the sisters, but I don't see any reason to doubt that record in the Gospels. So we know brothers and sisters. We don't know for certain the birth order. The Gospels suggest Jesus is the first. There's nothing in there that suggests in the Gospels that suggests that Joseph had children by a previous marriage. That's kind of made up out of whole cloth. So I don't really see any reason to take that particular version seriously. But anyway, they're possible.
And it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't, no. We're just trying to figure out like who he was. I kind of like the idea of Jesus as a middle child. just because maybe just because it's unorthodox, and I have unorthodox leanings, but whatever.
So you weren't the oldest child in your family.
I was not, no.
given what you've described and how you were just expressing yourself.
I may not be more like Jesus, but I'm definitely more like the prodigal son than the older son. Put it that way. So in that story, my story is more like his. Yeah. So anyway, but I think it's what order they were born in or what the actual answer is. It still tells us something about him because we know he had siblings. He had brothers and sisters. It tells us something about his upbringing and what that was like. If his father was, a common laborer, which is sort of the implication of carpenter. Jesus was a common laborer, as we say. We know they're not a really wealthy family. They have to struggle somewhat, probably financially. We can guess Jesus is not born in a wealthy household. He's born in kind of a struggling household, and probably from a very young age has to work to help support the family. He's a carpenter before he's a preacher. Probably his brothers were too, and his sister probably chipped in. So, so that tells us a little bit. Tells us a little bit about him just from the fact that he's not an only child, right? So maybe he's not going to have the psyche of an only child. He's going to have the psyche of one among many, I guess.
Right.
And again, looking at the patterns of birth order, he seems to me more like a middle child, a second or third, rather than a first child. But again, that's not a universal law. That's just a sort of generalization. So, what about his family? We know that according to the Gospel of Mark, and there's no reason to doubt this particular story, when Jesus came back to his hometown to convey his message, his family heard about it and they came out to get him because they thought he was beside himself, is the phrase that's used there. Well, that was just a nice way of saying they thought he was crazy and they wanted to get him out of the public eye. So I don't know that they were necessarily estranged so much as they were concerned and didn't understand what he was doing. They were concerned about him, what he was doing. And so maybe out of love, they wanted to sort of bring him back into the household and protect him from, creating problems for himself by saying and doing these wild things. They heard these accusations. So at some point, they were not with him. The family was not with him. But at some point, they got with him, because we're told that Mary was present at the crucifixion with the other Mary. She was present when they went to anoint him in the tomb and found the empty tomb, probably. But we also know from the book of Acts and other documents that Mary was sort of embraced by the followers of Jesus. She was part of that after community. So he must have reconnected, and maybe more to the point, it's clear that his brother James became the leader of the church after Jesus was no longer with them physically, and that his brother Judas also was an important figure, or Jude. The Epistle of James is thought to have been written either by James, the brother of Jesus, or of someone who was one of his students. That happened frequently. A student would write a letter based on what they were taught. Okay, so James or someone from the community that he led, someone close to him. And the other gospel, or the other letter, is Jude. And Jude, according to tradition, also was written by, according to some traditions anyway, was written by Jesus' brother, Jude, or Judas. And probably titled Jude rather than Judas, partly because they made Judas the disciple a kind of villain. And so they want to make clear it's not that guy. It's not Judas Iscariot. So they use like a Greek form, which means Jude.
I figured that much.
And when you read the letter of Jude, just you might want to take a look at that sometime if you haven't. It's hard to think of any other reason why that particular letter would have been incorporated into the New Testament, except that it was believed that Jesus' brother wrote it. It's not a particularly inspiring letter. You don't really hear it quoted a lot. It's an interesting letter in a lot of ways, and may tell us something about, it tells us something about the background, the context, because he makes reference to, for example, the book of Enoch. So this is before, obviously long before books were made canonical. And so whoever wrote Jude was familiar with the book of Enoch, which was a book that a lot of the early Christians drew from because they saw things in there that seemed to them to be messianic prophecies that they could apply to Jesus. So that's part of the reason, but also it's just a very popular book in that era. So there's interesting things about him. But anyway, the point regarding family is his brothers all got involved, or at least these two brothers. We don't know about the others. And apparently his sisters also were there, although we don't really know much about them. But they are mentioned in the books as being around. So yeah, Maya.
What would have been then the relationship with I to tell you the truth, I didn't realize that James became the leader. I always thought, it was Peter, upon
Right.
this rock I shall whatever.
You've been brainwashed by Catholic dogma, Maya.
I think so. I'm a
Yes.
Catholic girl through and through.
You go talk to an Eastern Orthodox person and they'll tell you about James, because he was considered first. He was the head of the Church of Jerusalem, or the Eastern Orthodox churches. He's more important to them. And the book of Acts tells us that James was the leader of the church in Jerusalem.
Wow.
I mean, it's right there in your Bible,
Right.
And so the whole thing about Peter being built on the rock, that was church politics. There was competition between churches in Jerusalem, especially, but also I think in Constantinople, Antioch, and Rome. And the bishops were always trying to one-up each other. And so the only passage that, that they could hang their hat on was, well, Jesus said that Peter was the rock, and Peter came to Rome. Therefore, Rome's the most important church. But I would go like, wait a minute. Peter was in Jerusalem before he was in Rome. Peter went to a lot of places, right? Well, Paul came here too. Oh, okay. So you got two very highly regarded figures in the church. That's part of their argument that we're more important than you are, kind of thing. And of course, they already had going for them. That was the center of the empire. There's a lot of wealth there. Military power came out of there. So Rome had kind of an edge up. But yeah. So you bought into, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you bought into, a myth that was created for political reasons by the Pope in Rome.
Another one of those.
An illusion shattered.
Wow.
Peter was very important, though. Don't get me wrong. Peter was very important in the early church. He was one of the leaders, and he was very close to Jesus. He probably was closer to Jesus than James was. So maybe there's a case to be made there. But if you look at all the evidence, it's clear James was the leader. He was accepted as the leader after Jesus, and Peter was. Peter was important, but so were the other James and John. James and John, the brothers, they were also sort of pillars of the community. So anyway, yeah, it's that's kind of where Christian history overlaps with the Gospels, and you kind of have to be careful what you really think is true. If you don't know that little bit of history, it starts making more sense. But anyway, also I'll mention one other Jesus relative, and then I'll stop for a minute. But Jesus also had a cousin named Simeon, and Simeon was supposed to be the son of Joseph's father, or Joseph's brother. So he was like Jesus's cousin. Simeon also is known from church records to have been a successor as the leader of the church. So you had, I think it was first James, I think next was Jude, and there may have been one other one in between there, and then there was Simeon. Okay, and so the Jesus family was involved for for a while in the early church, which is sort of interesting.
Interesting, yeah.
And we're out of time. So
Yeah.
we got through the virgin birth and Jesus's family, and
Big
still
stuff.
other questions
Okay.
hanging out there. So
I just wanted to know if you all are open for me to send you.